So I uploaded a video yesterday called "The Syrian Civil War has entered its final days," and that was a mistake because I uploaded that yesterday, and what it should have said is that the Syrian Civil War has entered its final hours. Within 10 minutes of me uploading that video, it was confirmed by CNN that there were rebel fighters inside Syria's capital, and only a couple hours later it was confirmed by actors within the Syrian military that the regime was over and Assad had fled to Moscow. And I did say in the video that the map I was showing was probably going to be inaccurate because of how quickly things were moving, but even with all the extreme language I used to express how quickly the situation was developing, even I was astounded by how quickly things wrapped up. But I do think it's a fair question to ask, like, why did it end so quickly, as it were? I mean, Damascus was taken without a fight, and I think it's fair to ask why that was the case. Why is it that one of the most brutal dictators in the world, or a man who was several hours ago, why did he, after years of using chemical weapons against his own people and brutally suppressing them at every turn, why did he turn and run without a fight or some vindictive final attempt to hold power? I think there are two main reasons why things wrapped up the way that they did and why Damascus was abandoned without a fight. And I think the first reason is that Assad couldn't take everyone with him. I mean that quite literally. He was only able to escape with his family to Moscow, and some of his loyalists had to stay behind. Now, fortunately for them, as we've seen in Assad's prime minister, who's temporarily allowed to stay on as PM for the time being, it looks like in an attempt, I would say, in quite a negative interpretation, the rebels have understood that if they just start killing Assad loyalists, that's not going to get them off on the right foot when it comes to establishing diplomatic relations with the rest of the world. It's good politics by the rebels to grant amnesty to people that were in Assad's regime, because first of all, not all of those people did so willingly, cooperating with the regime, and second of all, anyone that was a part of the regime knows that they don't have to resort to militarism or fleeing the country when it comes to dealing with this new regime. They can be a part of it and work with the rebels in whatever Syria's new government is going to look like. But would they have been that generous to Assad's loyalists if Damascus had to be taken in a weeks-long siege and campaign with tens of thousands of deaths and possibly the use of chemical weapons against the rebels? Because technically Assad could have done that. He could have launched a month-long siege of Damascus and held on to the end, and then just flown to Moscow anyway at the end of that. But that is a really hard thing to pitch to the people that support you that have to stay behind. I just don't think Assad had anywhere near the charisma or the political capital to sell to his own commanders and his own politicians. I want you guys to stay and fight until the very end. Then I'll leave, and you guys deal with the consequences of the tens of thousands of furious rebels that you've just been fighting for months who are going to be wanting revenge. So that's a pretty surface-level interpretation of what happened. Assad realized things were over, and he could not sell to his allies the idea to keep fighting, so he made the decision to get out of there while he could. Now, the second possibility, which maybe not contradictory with the first, maybe these are both factors of the truth, but the second thought is one that I've been thinking about for the last day or so, and I've seen some people talking about it, and that is the idea that potentially Vladimir Putin specifically told Assad to leave without a fight. This idea mainly comes from the fact that we know that the Russians and the Syrian rebels were in communication in the moments leading up to Assad's final defeat and subsequent fleeing from Syria. Because it seems that the Russian government is claiming that they have come to an agreement with the rebels that will allow them to keep their military bases and their port in Syria. Russia's influence in Syria allows them to project strength much better than they could otherwise. Their main focus being that port that they have in Syria. It's a warm water port, meaning unlike most Russian ports, it doesn't freeze over the winter. And it is their only port in the Mediterranean, which allows them to project naval strength in that area. So knowing how valuable the Russians' influence in Syria actually is to them, I don't think it's unreasonable to put two and two together, look at the chain of events and think, okay, most likely what has occurred here is that they've gotten in touch with the rebels, the Russians that is, and they've basically said, we want to keep our port and our bases in Syria. In exchange, we will get in contact with Assad and we will tell him to surrender Damascus without a fight and flee the country immediately. And this is another very important point. The Russian government is claiming that Assad, before leaving, in communications with rebels in his final moments in Syria, expressed to them and to people around him within his faction that there would be a peaceful transfer of power. Now, Assad has not publicly said that himself. That is just a claim from the Russian government. But if it's true, it's very important. The reason that's important is because if Assad was leaving and made the announcement that he would one day be back and to resist the rebels and keep fighting, that would prolong the civil war for God knows how long. Assad claiming he accepts the transition of power and he's not going to fight anymore is a massive boon to the rebels, because that essentially delegitimizes any pro-Assad factions left in the country, because they would have nothing left to fight for, hypothetically, in the future. So basically, to look back on this, I think there are two major factors at play that stopped Assad from turning the siege on Damascus into the largest, bloodiest, and most awful battle of this war. The first one being, he did not have a card to play in terms of winning the war from here, and he certainly did not have the ability or the strength or the charisma or the political capital to tell people to die for him in vain in this battle, this fruitless battle to try and hold Damascus. And the second thing is that his biggest benefactor, the Russian state, looked at this situation and it had one chip left to play to try and hold on to some of its influence in Syria. And that was essentially giving the entire country on a platter to the rebels and helping them avoid some prolonged battle around Syria's capital. The rebels' victory, an entire lightning offensive over not even the last 2 weeks, was only possible because Assad's main benefactor, his main source of strength that he could draw on, the Russian state, was preoccupied with the war on its doorstep. With all its focus and resources on Ukraine, Russia did not have the time, energy, money, or resources to try and save Assad. So at least what I believe the Russians have done is cut a deal in the final moments to try and hold on to a sliver of power comparatively to what they had before when Assad was in power. I think it's all quite ironic if you think about it. The Russian state, in an attempt to expand its influence militarily in Europe and push into Ukraine, opened itself up to other weaknesses. And because of that, it has essentially lost the center of its influence in the Middle East, probably for decades now. That's the thing about being a violent dictator who projects power through force and military might. It makes you want to take risks. And sometimes those risks are worth it, but sometimes when you risk it all, you lose it all. And while the Russian state certainly hasn't lost everything, it has certainly lost a lot today.